Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., and this is now our Christmas program. It's December 21st here in Washington, and time for the next to last program of the old year of 2012. The apocalyptic thinkers, right? The people who expected the end of the world have been disappointed so far. The Mayan calendar does not seem to be kicking in. We don't have the Mayan apocalypse, but we have the Maya apocalypse. We'll talk about that in our second segment. That is the austerity ghoul Maya McGinnis as a kind of typical harpy or fury tormenting humanity with genocidal austerity. We'll get to her in the second part of the program. But, if you listen to Ron Paul's standard stump speech in his campaign, it was full of apocalyptic ideas. For some reason, always hyperinflation. Never deflation, always hyperinflation. That doesn't seem to come about. As the scripture says, you don't know when. Right? You do not know when. Believe me, you don't know when. And as I would add, every prediction of the end of the world has a definite class content. And when Helicopter Ben Bernanke coined the term, the fiscal cliff, earlier this year, he did that as part of a very specific strategy of ruling class demagogy designed to advance the interests of the parasitic banking elite and the lunatic ruling class, the so-called 1%. We are now in the midst of the haggling over this fiscal cliff, this chimera. There is, of course, there is real damage that is set to occur, but the idea that this is somehow the end of the world, this is wrong, and also it's perfectly susceptible to being cured after the fact in the new year. It was widely admitted this week, even in the controlled media, that if you're on the side of working people, you have no particular phobia about allowing the Bush tax cuts to lapse. That can then be fixed relatively easily. But the idea that somehow it's a public interest to avoid the Bush tax cuts, that you think about that, right? That we have to hang on to what Bush did. Well, this is also fallacy, and it plays into the hands of the reactionaries. But now we've got the Republican reactionaries that have, for the moment, blocked Obama's attempt for a sellout. Obama was determined to exact his pound of flesh. He wanted to impose the controlled consumer price index, the so-called chained CPI, the chained consumer price index. And this is a way to gouge Social Security. And a breathtaking reversal. Going into the haggling about the fiscal cliff, Obama, the man of the people, who ran on a platform of defending the entitlements. Although, if you were reading carefully, as some of us were, you could see that he intended no such thing, that he was always eager for a sellout. But in his campaign, he tried to give the dupes, the low-information voters, the notion that he was there to defend entitlements, the social safety net, your economic rights as validated by the New Deal, the Great Society, and the New Frontier. But he said at the beginning, Social Security is off the table. And suddenly, in the course of this past week, Social Security came back in through the back door in time to be looted and chiseled and gouged and sacked. And this is the chained CPI. This is a piece of monstrosity. You've often heard it said on this program, the difference between Romney and Obama was what? Well, that Romney was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a madman coming at you with a chainsaw and determined to impose killer cuts immediately, right? To basically hack everybody into succotash in the first 3 minutes. With the case of Obama, it's the death of 1,000 cuts. And that is what the chained CPI would do to the average Social Security benefit, right? We have the shills of MSNBC, Larry O'Donnell, or whatever his name is, this nonentity who does the 10 o'clock program on MSNBC. He assures us, oh, well, the chained CPI, that would only mean 1%. Yeah, 1% maybe the first year, but in the successive years, it's going to be 1% and 1% and 1% and maybe more on compound interest. The trick is that they want to understate inflation. This is not the first time they've done it. Going back 20 years, pick up a copy of Surviving the Cataclysm, Your Guide to the Worst Financial Crisis in Human History, the first edition, 1999, and the second edition, 2009. You will find in there a discussion of a similar gouging and falsification of the Consumer Price Index carried out by the infamous Michael Boskin, who was a creature of the first Bush administration, that is to say, of Bush the Elder. And his story was that the existing CPI of the Labor Department at that point, the market basket of goods and their prices, he said it overstated inflation. It said that inflation was too much, and therefore the entitlement beneficiaries were getting increases that were too generous, right? Their cost of living allowances and adjustments were too big. So already with Boskin 20 years ago, there was a first gouging and reduction in the way that the actual rate of inflation is reflected, right? It's clear to everybody. You can go to these libertarians, for example, at Shadow Government Statistics and see their estimate of what the Consumer Price Index really has been. It has been much more than what the government is willing to admit. And you don't have to be a Ron Paul freak to recognize that fact. But so now we got the second round. So what the idea is that over time, Social Security would wither on the vine. The benefit would become less and less and less until eventually it dried up and blew away. That's the chained CPI. Now, Boehner, from a position of overwhelming weakness, of ideological isolation and being on the defensive, can nevertheless could and can, on Obama to try not just to bail him out, but to shower him with concessions that he could never get in a real negotiation. We've always said Obama negotiates with himself, a strange habit that he has. Obama negotiates with himself. At the beginning, you may recall, he wanted $1.6 trillion of revenue. Well, actually, let me go back even further. Before this year, before this current haggling session, back in the spring of 2011, Obama already granted $1 trillion in killer cuts. And I say killer cuts because any cuts in social programs represent genocide. They will kill people. It's a big difference. You can raise taxes on the rich by 5% or 10%, sure in the knowledge that you're not killing anybody. But if you gouge 5 to 10% out of food stamps or Medicaid or Medicare or unemployment benefits, you can be sure that human lives will be lost. Dead bodies will result. That is why the current austerity proposals represent high crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg Code, the implied precedents of the Nuremberg trials, Germany 1946, where austerity ghouls of that age, also known as Nazis, were hanged for what they did. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C., our special Christmas program. We will have some holiday atmosphere here before too long, but we've got to bring you up to date, first of all, on the infamy and treachery of Obama, the reactionary furor of Boehner and his gang of Republican thugs. This is plain to all to see. Quite a few still having trouble seeing the depths of the treachery of Obama. So we got through 2011. As a result of the events of 2010 and 2011, Obama had signed off on $1 trillion, a lot of that killer cuts, a lot of it targeting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. He had already targeted those cuts, and he had, as part of Obamacare, one of the main things wrong with Obamacare is that contains between $500 billion and $700 billion, according to the accounting you use, of cuts. Those are killer cuts. They may not be cuts to the benefits received by individuals nominally, but when you go and cut payments to hospitals, payments to laboratories, payments to other key parts of the healthcare delivery system, that will also lead to increased morbidity and mortality. Those are killer cuts. This is not comparable to the effect of tax increases on rich people. Those do not kill. But cutting into these programs on which people rely who have no other recourse, those are cuts that kill. Therefore, the Nuremberg precedents should be the basic moral backdrop of what we're talking about here, and not the current policy wonk inside the Beltway debate, where these proposals for genocide are entertained as if they were just, another policy variation. So, between 2010 and 2011, Obama manages to deliver $1 trillion of budget cuts, mainly in the spring of 2011, $500 billion to $700 billion of cuts in Medicare and Medicaid as part of his Obamacare. By the end of 2010, he had extended the Bush tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires for another 2 years. That's the essentially the deadline that we're coming up to now. So that was already a very, very one-sided performance. Now, nobody in the wealthy elite called upon to cough up even an additional penny to deal with this crisis of debt, which they are the ones who claim is the existential crisis. And it's not good, although it's not at all the hysteria, not worth the hysteria that these rich parasites are willing to bring up. And then we get Obama with the Satan sandwich. Right? What we're living through now is a result of the Satan sandwich of August of 2011, which set up this situation with the sequester. Remember the 12 tyrants, the super committee, they were supposed to agree, they didn't agree, therefore we have this sequester, which has a lot of problems with the sequester. It will, among other things, have a terrible impact on the National Institutes of Health here, just a little bit north of Washington, D.C. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, Obama then comes into this current discussion. At the beginning, he says he wants $1.6 trillion of increased revenue, mainly in the form of tax cuts on the people over $250,000 per year income. That $1.6 trillion then turns into $1.4 trillion, and then turns into $1.2 trillion, without any compensating or completely trifling compensating concessions from this fascist gang of Republicans. So we've got a Wall Street shill, Obama, who is programmed to cave in, right? His treachery, his weakness, his cowardice, his status as a Wall Street agent, none of this has ever changed. He does the same thing. He's got a new aureola of mystical devotion from his acolytes on MSNBC. And at the same time, Obama is offering another $400 billion, an additional $400 billion in health care cuts. Now, let's see. We've got guaranteed $500 to $700 billion already cut under Obamacare, at least in terms of the authorization. $400 billion more. It gets us almost to $1.5 trillion, plus some money out of that trillion of cuts 2010, 2011. You can see Obama is putting up a heavy attack. He was putting that together with a mere $100 billion of defense cuts and $100 billion of domestic discretionary, which is also, these are also very, very misguided. If you want to make defense cuts, you better put in the money to reconvert, and you better have a space program and an energy program and a mass transit program so that you can reconvert seamlessly those defense industries into the technological future of the country. You simply shut those things down. That's committing national suicide. I'm sorry. Ultra-lefts don't want to hear that. But those are the only modern...